Good evening and welcome to the conference, Alienation, the Truth Regarding the Trauma and Abuse. I'm delighted to be part of this important event, and my opening presentation is focused on the topic of parental alienation as a form of family violence and child abuse. It kind of sets the stage for my keynote presentation tomorrow, which will be looking at the trauma of parental alienation. I'll touch upon some of these concepts related to the relationship between trauma and parental alienation a bit this evening, but that will be the main focus of my presentation tomorrow. So thank you to the conference organizers for allowing me this opportunity. It's an important conference, and I'm really delighted to be part of this event. Now, the first thing I would say is that the alienation of parents from the lives of their children after parental separation is a unique form of complex trauma for both targeted parents and their children. It's also a form of family violence and child abuse that's resistant to therapeutic intervention unless it's addressed at a very early stage, mainly at a systemic level. Prevention of parental alienation is the priority. And a trauma-informed approach is needed in this area. So in this presentation, I will examine the current thinking and research on parental alienation as a form of family violence and child abuse. You can see in my agenda that I'll begin with an overview of current parental alienation theory and research, defining parental alienation as a form of family violence and child abuse. And secondly, I'll be looking at the effects of parental alienation on children in particular. At the outset, I should say that my perspective is that of a sociologist and a social work practitioner. And as such, my expertise lies in applying a systemic perspective to assessing social problems like parental alienation and addressing social problems first and foremost at a systemic level. I do, though, also apply a psychological lens to the issue, having worked as a counselor and family mediator, and I'm also writing a column on parenting after separation for the popular journal Psychology Today, in fact. I've been studying parental alienation since 1985, although I rarely use the term parental alienation to describe a phenomenon that's generated a great deal of controversy. I actually try to stay out of the controversy and try to explore common ground between the warring factions in this particular controversy. The term parental alienation itself is very triggering to many people. It's a label that kind of tends to focus on the phenomenon as an individual pathology. The cause of the idea that parental alienation is kind of a syndrome, especially, suggests that the root cause is individual pathology in the alienating parent. And a lot of people react very negatively to this. I think if I could, I would change the title of my presentation to "The Forceful Removal of Parents." The forceful removal of children from parents and grandparents' lives, or even more to the point, the forceful removal of parents and grandparents from children's lives. I should also add that I adopt a child-focused perspective in my work on parental alienation. Although parental well-being is important and children's well-being is connected to the well-being of their parents, it's because children are the most adversely affected by separation and divorce of their parents, and the most vulnerable members of the family system during parental separation and divorce, that we have to prioritize their needs as paramount. I prefer to move away from an adult expert-based approach to the best interest of the child. It was I think it was Hillary Clinton who said way back, I think she was Hillary Rodham at the time, she said, the best interest of the child is nothing but an empty vessel into which adult prejudices are poured. A very cynical view. She was a family lawyer at the time. But I think it's true. We tend to look at best interests from the perspective of adults and experts. We need more of an evidence-based understanding of the best interest of the child from the perspective of the child. What do children themselves say is in their best interests? And I prefer to proceed from that point of view. I also believe that parents are the best guardians of children. And my mantra, I guess I would say, is it's the responsibility of social institutions to support, not undermine parents in the fulfillment of their parenting responsibilities to their children's needs. And that's not happening. Increasingly, parental authority, autonomy, and responsibility, most importantly, is being undermined by our social institutions, by our educational institutions, by courts, child welfare organizations. Parents need support more than anything. That's the key to meeting the best interests of children. But there are circumstances where the forceful removal of parents from children's lives is warranted. Situations of child abuse and child neglect, where the safety of children is the paramount consideration. Children need to be protected from abusive and neglectful parents. And child maltreatment takes many forms, physical as well as emotional. But most separations involve two fit and loving parents and responsible parents who have shared responsibility for their children while they're living together, and upon separation, want to continue to care for their children. In many situations today, unfortunately, after parental separation and divorce, parental alienation rears its ugly head. It's a particularly egregious form of family violence and child abuse. The forced removal of a fit and loving parent from the life of a child is the worst form of uprooting of a child. It's also abusive because a child is taught, groomed, and manipulated to hate, or even worse, simply erase a parent from their thoughts and lives. Now, keep in mind, when we talk of parental alienation, we're not talking about the forced removal of an abusive or a neglectful parent. We're talking about the forced removal of a fit and loving parent. So probably the best title for my talk would be The Unjustified Forceful Removal of a Parent from the Life of a Child as a Form of Family Violence and Child Abuse. The removal of a fit and loving parent from the life of a child. So in regards to this, I've grappled with this sort of problem of what to call this phenomenon since 1985. In 1985, that's when I started studying this phenomenon. I went overseas from Canada to Scotland to the University of Edinburgh to complete a PhD on why it is that so many non-custodial fathers lose all contact with their children after separation and divorce. And the assumption was that fathers just weren't interested. They were footloose and fancy-free after separation. They were content to let their wives take full responsibility for children, emotionally, physically, financially. These were deadbeat dads. That was all the craze at that time. The term parental alienation had not yet been coined, or rather, actually, it was just beginning to be used in 1985 by Richard Gardner, psychiatrist in the United States. Richard Gardner defined parental alienation as an individual pathology in the child and the alienating parent and put the blame squarely on the shoulders of alienating parents. His view of parental alienation was based on his clinical practice with children and families of divorce, a clinical sample of highly toxic, alienating parents and severely affected children. His was a clinical perspective focused on individual parental pathology, the pathology of the alienating parent. Now, my own research in 1985 was also based on my own clinical experience with children and families of divorce as a school counselor and a child protection worker. As a clinician, my views were also biased, I would say. I worked mainly with single mothers and their children who were suffering the effects of father absence. And as a clinical social worker, I kind of bought into the stereotype of the deadbeat dad. As I say, that was all the rage in 1985. There was a big study in the US by sociologist Frank Furstenberg that found that fully half of non-custodial fathers lost contact with their children. It was just assumed that they were deadbeat dads, period. But it did kind of gnaw at me, and I wanted to know why. In 1985, I decided to focus my PhD research on this question. Why is it that so many fathers lose contact with their children? And what are the factors that are they in fact deadbeat dads? My views actually changed once I interviewed 100 fathers in Scotland and in Canada based on court records on their experiences. And in fact, I found that from the phenomenological perspective of fathers themselves, I found that fathers were the farthest thing from deadbeat dads. These fathers were suffering a grief reaction containing all the elements of a major bereavement related to the absence of their children in their lives, the loss of their role as fathers, and the constraints of the visiting relationship. And I kind of concluded that there are structural factors. Fathers attributed, they kind of blamed the system as the problem, not so much their wives. They said it was, kind of a very biased system in which they saw themselves having very little chance of being in any way having a meaningful role to play in their children's lives. If the mothers did, had sole custody, they were kind of relegated to the fringes. And the fathers that were the most closely involved and attached were the ones that suffered most and were the most likely to become alienated from their children's lives. So I didn't actually use the term alienation. I used the term involuntary paternal disengagement. And I saw this alienation phenomenon as a phenomenon in which both both structural factors, the legal system that prevents fathers from having a meaningful role in their children's lives, and their father's own psychological response to the loss of their children, this grief reaction that caused them to become alienated from their children, although I didn't use the term alienation. It was involuntary, forced removal of fathers from children's lives. So I discovered that the so-called deadbeat dad phenomenon was largely a myth, and not only a myth, but it drew attention away from the systemic injustices facing children and fathers in particular, but also non-custodial mothers after parental separation. Yes, deadbeat dads do exist, but mine was a representative sample of 100 fathers drawn from court records. I replicated that research 20 years later with another sample of 100 fathers, and I found that the great majority of fathers were of the fit and loving variety. My research painted a very different picture of fathers. Fathers were traumatized by the loss and absence of their children. They were suffering this grief reaction. 20 years later, they were experiencing full-blown PTSD. Because in the intervening 20 years, fathers' roles with children changed dramatically. They were much more active, involved, attached, and influential in their children's lives. And what I found to be a grief reaction in 1985, 20 years later, I found to be full-blown PTSD. And the more severe the alienation, the more severe their trauma and their post-traumatic stress. So a little bit about parental alienation theory and research. Parental alienation and family violence basically go hand in hand. They're two sides of the same coin. Parental alienation is a type of family violence. It's also a form of child psychological abuse. Parent alienation has at its roots the demonization of the other parent. There's an individual pathology behind that demonization process, no question. But parental alienation, as I see it, is more of a social problem than just an individual pathology. It's both, actually, but when social pressures from social institutions push us toward adversarial conflict, we act accordingly. And what we expect of others, they endeavor to provide. If we expect people to retain a lawyer and fight like hell for ownership of their children, when their own relationship with their children is threatened, that's what they'll do. If we expect them to cooperate and collaborate and co-parent and provide the supports necessary for them to do so, then they will act accordingly as well. The system often forces people to act in harmful ways as adversaries, as enemies. When the stakes are high, the potential for violence escalates. So parental alienation and intimate partner violence are social problems, and the adversarial system is the main cause of parental alienation and domestic violence. In the realm of parental separation, we see a lot of legal and administrative abuse in particular, in addition to parental alienation. But legal and administrative abuse is a particularly toxic form of intimate partner violence. Essentially, what happened is that with legal abuse is that we invite the legal system into our lives to apply force to remove the other parent as a primary caregiver from the lives of our child. This is a threat and a trauma of great proportions, leading to escalating conflict and at times first-time family violence. Fully 50% of first-time violence occurs within the context of that kind of adversarial divorce. So this is a systemic issue and a form of collective family violence and child abuse. Since my studies of non-custodial fathers, I've undertaken research on non-custodial mothers and grandparents cut out of children's lives. And what links these studies is the experience of parental alienation as an experience of profound grief, loss, and trauma. In addition to my own research on parental alienation, a vast amount of research has been undertaken by others on the impact of parental alienation as a form of both family violence and psychological child abuse. Parental alienation, particularly when in looking at children, is a form of childhood trauma and a form of child abuse and neglect. It's a very serious form of child maltreatment. Parental alienation is an extreme manifestation of child psychological abuse, which is a category of dysfunction in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychological Association, which includes two symptom clusters identified in the DSM. One, impaired functioning in behavioral, cognitive, and affective domains. Okay, this impaired functioning I'll talk about in children, I'll talk about in a moment. And secondly, and this is really important, this is the second symptom cluster in the DSM pertaining to child psychological abuse. Quote, negative attributions of the other's intentions, hostility toward or scapegoating of the other, and unwarranted feelings of estrangement on the part of the child toward the alienated target parent. That's basically parental alienation to a T. So the DSM doesn't use the term. We've made attempts to have it included in the DSM, but why? It's already there. It's called child psychological abuse. It's a form of child psychological abuse, and the two main symptom clusters: number one, impaired functioning on the part of the child, seriously impaired functioning in many domains. Second is this idea of unjustified rejection of the other, hostility toward the other, scapegoating toward the parent, unwarranted feelings of estrangement, unjustified removal of a parent from a child's life. So, what are the effects of parental alienation on children? In parental alienation situations, children lose the capacity to give and accept love from a parent. They're manipulated to hate the parent, the targeted parent, despite children's innate desire to love and be loved by both their parents. An alienating parent's denigration results in the child's emotional rejection of the parent and the loss of a capable and loving parent from the life of a child. Such emotional abuse is just as debilitating, often more so than physical or even sexual abuse of children. We also know that children witnessing the abuse of a parent, which is essentially what's happening in situations of parental alienation, is also a particularly harmful form of child abuse. Alienated children have front row seats to witnessing the abuse of one of their parents. The severe effects of parental alienation on children are well documented: low self-esteem and self-hatred, depression, social isolation, poor academic performance, and substance abuse and other forms of addiction and self-harm are widespread. So rather than going through the multitude of studies that are out there on parental absence in children's lives, particularly unjustified parental absence and basically the effects of parental alienation on children, I've kind of lumped together, I've identified basically 5 categories of harmful effects as documented in the literature, which you can see in this slide. First is self-hatred, particularly disturbing among affected children. It's one of the more serious effects of parental alienation or any form of child abuse. Self-hatred. It's common in situations of parental alienation. Teaching hatred of the other parent is tantamount to instilling self-hatred in a child, because children see themselves as composed of half of their mother, half of their father. Children, it's self-hatred, basically. I hate one half of me, basically. Children also internalize the hatred toward the alienated parent. They're led to believe that the alienated parent doesn't love or want them in their lives. They experience severe guilt related to betraying the targeted parent. Their self-hatred and depression is rooted in feelings of being unloved by one of their parents and from separation from that parent, while being denied the opportunity to mourn the loss of that parent or even to talk about the parent. And of course, a parent, they're not getting a lot of love from the alienating parent either. A parent who is more concerned about hurting the other parent rather than really focusing on the needs of the child, what kind of love is that? And teaching hatred to a child. Hatred is not an emotion that comes naturally to children. It has to be taught. A parent who would teach a child to hate or fear the other parent represents a grave and persistent danger to the mental and emotional health and well-being of the child. Second category, alienated children also exhibit severe psychosocial disturbances due to exposure to parental alienation. These include disrupted socio-emotional development, lack of trust in relationships, social anxiety, social isolation. These kids have difficulties forming and maintaining relationships and tend to discard people whenever they experience a negative reaction to them. As adults, they tend to enter partnerships earlier, more likely to divorce or dissolve their cohabiting unions, and are more likely to have children outside any partnership, and are more likely to become alienated themselves from their own children. Third, alienated children exhibit low self-sufficiency, a lack of autonomy, a lingering dependence on the alienating parent. They have a risk of becoming psychologically vulnerable and codependent vis-a-vis the alienating parent. Fourth, alienated children experience difficulties controlling their impulses and struggle with addiction and self-harm. They're more likely to smoke, drink alcohol, and abuse drugs, as well as to succumb to behavioral addictions, more likely to be promiscuous, foregoing contraception, and becoming teenage parents. Fifth, alienated children are more likely to play truant from school, leave school at an early age. They're less likely to attain academic and professional qualifications in adulthood. They're more likely to experience unemployment, have low incomes, and remain on social assistance. They seem to aimlessly drift through life. Now, I could go on and categorize, the wide range of physical health, mental health effects. There's a tremendous amount of data out there on the effects of both father absence and mother absence in children's lives, the effects on both boys and girls, and just the effects of parental alienation are absolutely devastating when it comes to children. Of the 4 different types of abuse, meaning physical, sexual, emotional abuse, and neglect, parental alienation is usually considered to be a form of severe emotional or psychological abuse. However, it often co-occurs with the other 3 types of child abuse. Neglect, because alienating parents' hatred of the target parent is stronger than their love of their child. They're less attuned to and thus neglect the needs of the child. In regard to physical and sexual abuse, children in situations when one parent is absent from their lives are significantly a greater risk than children who have meaningful relationships with both parents. For example, they research on children from father-absent homes. Children from father-absent homes are 5 times more likely to have experienced physical abuse and emotional maltreatment. They're exposed to 100 times higher risk of fatal abuse. This is from a study from 1988. We've known this. Children have a higher risk of physical health problems, psychosomatic health symptoms, illness, such as acute and chronic pain, diabetes, asthma, headaches, stomach aches, and feeling sick. This is based on research from the 1990s. These kids run greater mortality and morbidity risks. They're more likely to die as children. That's a study from 1993. They live an average of 4 years less over the lifespan, a 2003 study. They're more likely to experience problems with sexual health and contracting sexually transmitted infections, studies from the 1990s. And the Journal of Ethnology and Sociobiology reported that preschoolers who are alienated from one of their parents are 40 times more likely to be sexually abused. We've known this for years, and yet we've not acted. Is this acceptable? It's clear that collectively these effects constitute a severe form of child and adolescent trauma, which persists into adulthood, and we have to do all we can to prevent this. I'll end my talk with just a few kind of key points to end. The key to working with victims of parental alienation is to adopt a trauma-informed approach. We're talking about severe trauma in affected children and targeted parents. Parental alienation is a unique form of complex trauma for both targeted parents and their children. Theories of grief and loss are central to any understanding of parental alienation as a form of trauma. A second important element in working with victims of parental alienation is to be knowledgeable about the nature of violence and oppression. Parental alienation is a wound inflicted from outside by external agents who gain power over their victims and abuse that power. Systemic forces in particular are implicated in parental alienation. So In conclusion, number one, safety must be our priority. The safety of affected children and parents. Secondly, a rebuttable legal presumption of shared parenting will prevent parental alienation and other forms of family violence. Thirdly, a rebuttable presumption against shared parenting is needed in cases of substantiated family violence, including parental alienation. And fourthly, providing support services and education programs about shared parenting and family violence, about parental alienation as a form of trauma, are needed in regard to, first of all, establishing providing support to parents who want to share the care of their children, but also educating people about the very real phenomenon of parental alienation as a form of family violence and child abuse. I'll be looking in more depth at the trauma of parental alienation in my keynote speech, and I look forward to your participation in that and to the discussion right now. Thank you.